Before Eve, there was Lilith, the first woman, erased from the Bible and buried in darkness. She wasn't just Adam's first wife, she was a demoness, cast aside for defying divine authority. Why was her story hidden, and why does her legacy still haunt us? This is the chilling tale of Lilith, a figure erased from history, but never from our nightmares. In ancient Babylon, long before the Bible was written, there were whispers of a woman who defied the very laws of creation. The earth trembled as the first woman was born, not from Adam's rib, but from the very same earth. This was Lilith, and her name would echo through the corridors of time as the one who dared to challenge the natural order. Lilith's story begins in the heart of Jewish mythology, in a time when stories of gods and humans intertwined with demons and spirits. In the Garden of Eden, where Adam would eventually find his companion, there was a woman who existed long before Eve. She was not made from Adam's rib, but from the same earth, created as his equal, not his subordinate. A powerful, independent being, Lilith was set apart from Eve, who would later be fashioned from Adam's own body, a symbol of dependence. But Lilith could not accept her role in a world that demanded submission. She refused to lie beneath Adam, rejecting the patriarchal role imposed on her. The Bible tells us Eve was created to be Adam's partner, but Lilith's defiance would not allow her to take that place. She left Eden, choosing exile over subjugation. Her flight from the garden wasn't just the act of a woman fleeing a man. It was the act of a woman rejecting divine authority itself, an act so terrifying it would be erased from sacred texts. What happened next is the origin of the fear that would follow Lilith's name through the ages. Lilith was cast into darkness, removed from the sacred garden, and transformed into a figure of horror. In her exile, she became something more than just a woman. She became a demoness. Once revered for her defiance, she was now feared for it. Her power grew, and she was said to prey on those who defied the natural order, particularly women and children. The first fear surrounding Lilith was the fear of a woman who refused to be controlled. Her disobedience marked her as a dangerous figure. She became the embodiment of all the things a society in the grips of patriarchal rule feared: sexual autonomy, independence, and defiance of divine will. Her image as a seductive dark force was cemented when stories of her night visits to men in their sleep emerged. Lilith's power became sexual in nature, linked to her ability to drain men of their strength. She was a demonic seductress, an incubus who haunted the nights. But Lilith's influence was not confined to men alone. She became a figure of terror for mothers. It was said that she would steal babies from their cradles, causing infant death and suffering. Her jealousy of women who could bear children became a constant theme in her dark mythos. Lilith was the first woman to defy nature, and in doing so, she became a force of destruction, a demoness of darkness. Her story, once rooted in empowerment, quickly evolved into one of terror. The story of Lilith, a woman who once stood equal to Adam, became a legend whispered with fear, but something else was stirring beneath the surface. The legend of Lilith wasn't confined to the pages of the Bible. Her story began long before the Israelites even set foot in the land of Canaan. She had ancient origins, rooted in a time when myths and demons blurred the lines between reality and the supernatural. The story of Lilith took shape amidst the mist-covered fields of ancient Mesopotamia, where the shadows of the past clung to every corner. The names of gods, spirits, and demons were whispered in the wind, their forms haunting the darkness. In the earliest recorded myths, there were spirits and demons that shared her essence, Lamashtu and Ardat Lili, both feared figures in Sumerian and Babylonian cultures. These entities were dangerous, preying upon newborns and pregnant women, and their influence was deeply rooted in the fear of the unknown. They weren't creatures to be casually discussed. They were dangers that could strike at any moment, silent and unseen. Much like Lilith, these ancient demons embodied the fear of forces beyond human control, waiting in the shadows to strike at the heart of life itself. But it wasn't just these ancient spirits that hinted at Lilith's arrival. It was the rituals and beliefs surrounding them. As these early civilizations worshipped their gods, they also feared the darkness that could descend if the gods were angered. In the flickering candlelight of sacred temples, priests would perform ancient rites to keep the spirits at bay. The air would be thick with incense, and the dim light would cast elongated shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to move as if they were alive. The whispered incantations would fill the air, meant to protect the living from the creatures that prowled in the dark. The more these rituals were performed, the more the villagers began to believe that the dangers of the dark were real, that something more than superstition lay in the night. The false comfort of light and rituals began to erode, replaced by a gnawing fear that no candle, no chant could dispel. There were tales of women who would venture too far into the wilds, only to be found days later, bodies cold and twisted, faces contorted in terror, their deaths unexplained. In those same darkened chambers where protection rituals were performed, there were always whispers in the dark, that these spirits had a name, Lilith. They spoke it only in hushed tones, as though even mentioning her could invite her wrath. In these ancient cultures, it wasn't just the gods they feared, it was the dark forces that could move between the worlds, slipping through cracks in the veil. Lilith, who had once been a symbol of defiance, was now feared as the mother of all demons, bringing death and chaos to those who dared defy the natural order. The rituals continued, and so did the fear, each word whispered in the dark, each flicker of flame in the candlelight, a futile attempt to keep back the creeping dread. But something more sinister was taking hold, something that wouldn't be kept at bay for much longer. And from the shadows, Lilith's influence grew stronger. As the centuries passed, the legends of Lilith grew more ominous. What began as whispered warnings in darkened temples soon transformed into unsettling signs, omens that suggested something unnatural was at work. The peaceful lives of ancient villagers began to crack under the weight of an unseen force. The first signs of something being terribly wrong were subtle at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence. But as they accumulated, they became impossible to ignore. One of the earliest signs was the sudden appearance of strange marks on the bodies of women and children. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A few townsfolk reported bruises on their skin, but these were no ordinary marks. They seemed to appear overnight, as if scratched by invisible hands. Some marks were faint, others deep and raw, but all were inexplicable. Strange symbols appeared on the bodies of women who had recently given birth, marks that resembled ancient, forgotten runes, the kind used in forbidden rituals. It was said these symbols were a sign that the Demoness Lilith had passed her. Gaze upon them. The mark of Lilith was rumored to be a curse, a sign that those marked would soon suffer grave misfortune. The elders who had heard the old tales of Lilith's wrath feared these marks were no coincidence. They whispered among themselves, their voices trembling as they warned the people to keep their children close and their homes locked tight after dark. But it wasn't just the marks. There were unnatural births as well. Women in the village began giving birth to deformed babies, some with too many fingers, others with pale, cold skin, and a few with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. The babies, once healthy, would die within days, their bodies pale and stiff, as if drained of life. The elders murmured that these births were the work of Lilith, her vengeance upon those who had defied her, or even worse, the unwanted offspring of her dark power. The fear intensified when the sickness began to spread. It was like a plague, slowly creeping across the village, touching everyone. Children developed high fevers and began speaking in nonsensical tongues, their eyes glazed and distant as if they were being controlled by a force they could not escape. The villagers believed it wasn't mere illness, it was Lilith's influence over them, her way of marking the children of those who had once defied her. Then came the odd behavior. Men began acting strangely, withdrawing from their families, becoming agitated and violent as if they were being possessed by something dark. Some claimed to hear whispers in the night, voices promising them power, offering a path away from their fearful lives. Others vanished without a trace, only to return days later with vacant eyes and strange tales of encounters in the wilderness where the shadow of Lilith was said to walk. As the village descended into chaos, the suspicion grew. Who or what might be marked? Who was next? And who had the power to stop it? The elders feared that the curse was not merely the work of the Demoness. They feared it was a sign of something far darker, something that had been unleashed and was now spreading. That was only the first crack in the story. As the days passed, the village that once thrived in peace began to unravel under the weight of growing fear. What had started with subtle signs now rippled through every corner of their existence, sinking deep into their bones. The sense of unease was no longer a whisper, it was a growing terror that threatened to consume everything. It started with livestock. The healthy cows and goats that once grazed happily in the fields began to fall ill, their bodies growing weak as if drained of life. The village's horses, once strong and proud, collapsed without warning, their eyes wide with terror, foaming at the mouth. The air was thick with the stench of death as animals dropped one by one, and no one could explain why. Farmers tried everything, herbs, prayers, even rituals to ward off evil, but nothing worked. The livestock died in droves, and with each loss, the village felt the grip of something unnatural tightening around their hearts. Next came the crops. The fields that had once yielded an abundance of grain and vegetables now withered away, as though the very earth had turned against them. The wheat stalks began to blacken and die, the roots rotting beneath the surface. No amount of water or tending seemed to revive the soil. The land itself was cursed, as if Lilith's dark power had seeped into the ground. The once productive fields, full of life, now stood barren and lifeless, echoing the hopelessness that began to settle into the villagers' hearts. As if this wasn't enough, something else moved in the shadows. At night, the villagers began to see strange figures lurking in the corners of their vision. Silhouettes that didn't belong, too tall, too thin, shifting unnaturally in the darkness. It wasn't just the cattle that were haunted. Men and women spoke of hearing whispers in the dead of night, voices calling their names from the shadows outside their homes. When they rushed to look, there was nothing. But the fear grew. The community felt it. They weren't just seeing shadows, they were being watched. The accusations began soon after. Neighbors who had once shared bread and laughter now pointed fingers at each other. Who was cursed? Who had done something to bring Lilith's wrath upon them? The rumors spread like wildfire. One woman was said to have given birth to a child with too many fingers. Another had spoken in tongues that no one could understand. Whispers of witchcraft filled the air. People who were once respected elders were now seen with suspicion, as if their mere presence invited the darkness closer. The town split into factions, some claiming the curse was God's punishment, others blaming the unholy rituals of Lilith that had begun to seep into the very fabric of their lives. The fear that had once been a murmur was now an open terror. Every day, more people grew ill, their bodies weakening, their eyes hollow. The sickly children who once seemed innocent were now seen as vessels of the Demoness herself. The community's bonds began to fracture as paranoia spread, with no one trusting anyone else. The darkness was no longer just outside their homes, it had taken root inside. The sense of dread became so thick, it was as though the very air was charged with something evil, something ancient, closing in on them. The sounds of laughter and conversation had long since died away, replaced by hushed whispers, eyes darting nervously at the corners of rooms. The villagers began to feel the terror in their sleep, waking to the oppressive weight of a nightmare they couldn't escape. The shadows outside their windows seemed to grow longer, reaching toward them, waiting, and from there everything grew darker. In their desperation, the villagers turned to anything that might protect them from the ever-growing darkness. Garlic hung at every door, its pungent scent filling the air in an attempt to ward off the unseen evil. But the garlic seemed to offer little more than a fleeting comfort, as if the very act of hanging it on the door frames was a feeble gesture, something they could hold on to when nothing else made sense. Salt was scattered in every corner of the village. The villagers followed ancient traditions, believing the salt would purify the land and keep malevolent spirits at bay. Every doorway was lined with salt, the streets dusted with it, and small bags were carried by those brave enough to venture outside after sundown. But like the garlic, it felt like a superstition, a desperate attempt to hold back a tide that couldn't be stopped. Protective rituals became a nightly occurrence. Each night was declared a sacred night, a time when the villagers would stay behind closed doors, pray, and perform rituals meant to fend off the darkness. The air would be thick with incense, and soft chants would fill the small homes, but the dread remained. No matter how many prayers were said, no matter how many rituals were performed, the villagers could feel it. The darkness was closing in, and they were powerless to stop it. Then came the secret gatherings. A small group of villagers, too terrified to share their fears aloud, met in the forest at night, away from the eyes of their fellow townspeople. Here, they tried to summon ancient powers, believing that calling upon older gods, older rites, might give them the strength to defeat the evil they felt creeping closer. But each ritual seemed to feed the terror, as though something darker was waiting to be unleashed. The more they fought back, the stronger the sense of inevitability grew. They weren't just defending against Lilith. They were fighting against an ancient force too powerful to understand, let alone defeat. And as the villagers gathered in fear, desperately seeking any salvation, the ground beneath them began to tremble, a low rumble that shook the earth. That moment opened a door that should have stayed closed. The terror that gripped the village did not end with the living. In fact, the worst was yet to come. For in a world where Lilith's curse had taken root, death was not the end. It was merely the beginning of something far darker. The villagers, already haunted by strange omens and twisted fates, began to experience the horrors of the dead. It started with the tragedies, the deaths that seemed unnatural, deaths that left questions more than answers. The livestock had died in strange circumstances, their bodies drained of life. The crops had withered for no reason. But when the people began to die, one by one, it became clear. Lilith's curse had not just struck their homes, it had reached into the very soul of the village. The first death was that of Miriam, an old woman known for her deep knowledge of herbs and healing. She had been a staple in the village, her remedies trusted by all. But after a strange illness swept through her home, she passed away suddenly, her face frozen in terror. The villagers thought it was just another victim of the plague. Yet, as her body was prepared for burial, something began to feel off. Her body refused to decay. It was as though she hadn't truly died. The villagers were unnerved, her limbs were stiff, her face twisted in an expression of eternal fear, and her skin seemed to retain an eerie paleness. The old woman, once a source of comfort, now seemed like a corpse that refused to be forgotten. The local priest, already shaken by the strange occurrences, performed the burial rites with haste, but his heart was filled with unease. The ritual was meant to lay Miriam to rest, to send her spirit to the afterlife, but there was a feeling in the air, an overwhelming dread, that this wasn't the end of her. In a desperate attempt to prevent her from rising, the villagers resorted to extreme measures. Stones were placed on her chest. a heavy weight meant to pin her soul to the earth. Nails were hammered into her hands and feet, driving them into the coffin in a final, violent attempt to trap her. But still, the villagers couldn't shake the feeling that her body was too unnaturally still, that Miriam's spirit had not gone quietly into the grave, but instead had been trapped in an eternal, restless state. This wasn't an isolated incident. The pattern repeated itself. Strange, unexplained deaths followed by the troubling burial rituals meant to keep the dead from rising. Bodies were pinned down, stakes driven through chests, and iron nails hammered into the coffins. Heavy stones were placed on graves, not only to weigh the bodies down, but to keep the restless souls from escaping. Every burial became an act of desperation, a frantic attempt to keep the dead from returning, because the villagers feared one thing more than death itself, that some souls could not be put to rest. There was something in the air, something the villagers couldn't explain but could feel in their bones. As they buried their dead, there was an overwhelming sensation that death was not the end, not anymore. The body could be laid to rest, but the spirit, it would not be bound so easily. A sense of dread hung over the burial grounds, a silent, ever-present fear that the souls of the dead had clawed their way into the world of the living, refusing to stay buried beneath the weight of stone and earth. As each burial took place, the villagers couldn't ignore the growing sense that they were not burying the dead, they were locking them away, trying to contain something far more dangerous than they could comprehend. The once quiet burial grounds became haunted, marked by the bloodstains of those who had tried to escape Lilith's curse. The graves themselves seemed to shift as if the dead were trying to push their way out, fighting against the finality of their resting places. The very ground seemed to churn with the fear that the dead were no longer content to stay in the dark, forgotten earth. Every night the villagers would hear sounds, the scraping of nails against wood, the low moans that rose from the burial grounds, whispers too faint to understand, but unmistakably human. Some spoke of seeing shapes moving among the gravestones, shadows too dark to belong to anything alive. The fear had become a presence that could be felt in every corner of the village, but it wasn't just the living who were causing it. It was the dead, restless souls, trapped in an eternal limbo between life and death. Because some of the dead refused to stay buried. As the nights grew darker, the ground trembled once more, and from the depths of the earth, something stirred, something that should have been left to rest. The dead, those once buried with heavy stones and iron nails, rose in the dead of night, not as the peaceful, quiet souls they once were, but as something horrible. They moved with unnatural speed, their faces twisted in an eternal scream, their limbs stiff from the grave. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, filled with the terror of those who had not been allowed to pass. In the moonlight, the village saw the truth. Lilith's curse had not been laid to rest. It had only just begun. What they had buried, with all their fear and ritual, was never meant to stay underground. And some say, if you listen closely enough, the whispers can still be heard in the dark.